Imagine visiting a loved one's gravestone at their site and realizing that it's the wrong stone or the plots have been mixed up. The remains are in the wrong place. As disturbing as this sounds, it does happen. Today, we're going to talk to Anton Kaminsky from Kaminsky Law about cemetery negligence, funeral home negligence, what is and what is not a case. Anton, thank you.
How are you, man?
I'm doing okay. This is always one of those heavy topics when we talk about it, and just has a different kind of weight to it than some of the other things you work on.
It certainly does, and it's something that we're pretty passionate about because I've seen so many horrible things. I've also seen so many things that are just not a case, and that we can kind of help people through. And we've even went out to cemeteries with families and kind of shown them that, hey, what the cemetery is saying is true.
Wow.
And you're okay here. And so, I take that very seriously. And I thought that this would be a good opportunity to talk about kind of what's completely standard conduct for a cemetery and what you should expect versus, hey, wait, this is a red flag.
Well, I think this is such an interesting topic is when we talk about damages, for example, we talk about there's this big emotional damage, right? It's not the same as like a slip and fall or one of those types of cases, right? So there's that component of it. This is all around emotion, right? And I think that for folks that do have a case, they might be sitting in this very emotional state where they've been planning this funeral and dealing with trying to get closure and all these different pieces, and they're not trusting their gut and maybe realizing that they do have a case here. And on the flip side, you're emotional and you're upset and you're dealing with all of that. And then you might suspect something's wrong and get additionally emotional and angry. We all have different ways we react to this kind of trauma. And you might be barking up the wrong tree and trying to hold the funeral home accountable or cemetery accountable for something they didn't do. So let's go through the list right now. Let's start. Where do we start, Anton? What are some of the things that you've seen that are not cases, right? That are situations where people really feel there was wrongdoing, but the funeral home, in fact, didn't do anything wrong or was in the right?
All right. So the one thing that I've seen at cemeteries often that people believe is a case, and it's sometimes a case, but most of the time it's not a case, is when they're moving headstones. So you have to understand that when they're, if you think of a cemetery that's packed with headstones, if they have to bury someone kind of dab in the middle of all those packed headstones, the only way to get their backhoe into that area is to move the existing headstones. And so what winds up happening sometimes is they will move a bunch of headstones away from the area. They'll put a backhoe in, they'll do the burial, and then they don't necessarily put the headstones back the same day or the next day or even sometimes the next week. And so if you come out to the cemetery and, the headstone yesterday was over here, but today it's over there, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, right?
It's got to be so, yeah, especially if you're, coming back to pay respects, maybe it's been an annual tradition and it just happens to fall on that time. That has to be, in general, I think that's probably a really emotional situation for somebody regardless. It's jarring, it's all of those things.
Yeah, and we get calls about that all the time, like, hey, my headstone was here, but now it's over there. And so what I tell people in that situation is, first and foremost, go to the cemetery, right? Go to the cemetery office and ask, have these headstones been moved because there's been a burial? And if they have, when are you guys going to put them back? Right? Sometimes it takes them a week or a day or a few days. And sometimes you just came the day after they moved them.
Happened, right.
Just so happened, right? So, that's completely standard for them to move things.
Let me ask you this, though. What if,
I was going to say,
you got the finger, or you go out.
No, I was going to say, but if you tell them to put them back, or if they, they say we've put them back and now they've put them in a place that's different than where it was supposed to be or where you expected it to be, now that's potentially a red flag that they don't even know where they need to put it back to.
So let me ask you, that was where I was going to go. So I think anytime you're moving something, the three things that come up for me are, number one, when you move something, you can potentially damage it. Is there, an element? This is a stone piece that's probably pretty durable and strong, but again, I assume they're using equipment to move them. They're very heavy. So number one, if you suspect damage. Number two, if they move them in the wrong position, and what I mean, and I'm saying position, not place. So, right. This is a plot. So if I put the stone back and it's at the right plot, but not quite in the right place, is that a red flag? At three, obviously, if they just put it in the wrong spot, I think we clearly know there's an issue.
Right. So cemeteries damage headstones all the time. yes, we don't really handle those cases because your remedy is for them to either fix the headstone or give you a new headstone. And you should really be able to do that on your own informally with a cemetery. Hopefully they're reasonable. Hopefully they're a normal company. Then say, oh yeah, we did make it. You could tell if somebody, scratched the headstone with a backhoe.
Right.
It's pretty obvious, right?
But we talk about damages, right? And the recourse of like, in some of these worst case scenarios where somebody that wasn't supposed to be cremated was cremated, or somebody is in the wrong plot definitively, right? They were supposed to be buried next to, grandma, and now they are in the wrong place now, right? Like, and the trauma, and, there's still, I'm sure, frustration and trauma with that's the stone I've been visiting for 1, 5, 10 years. And now there's a connection to it and it's been destroyed. Really the only recourse at that point, there's not a deeper damage at that point.
So when we think about damages, a lot of people think about emotional trauma. They think about physical injury. They think about monetary out-of-pocket costs, right? The one thing that you should think about with physical and emotional damages is how permanent are they?
Okay.
Right? Or how quick would they pass? For instance, if somebody loses your cremated remains and there's no way to find out where they are, that's permanent damage, right? Like you're never getting back these cremated remains. Or if they mixed up bodies in a funeral and you don't know whose body went where, and there's really no real way to track it down, that's unfortunately a permanent damage. When somebody scratches a headstone, yes, I get it. This is the headstone you've been, visiting, and this is the headstone that you picked out. But if they're able to replace that headstone with a new headstone, it's not really that permanent of a damage. You might, have this initial emotional distress, but it's not something somebody's going to pay you hundreds of thousands of dollars for.
Okay, and I think it's important for people to realize and know that these are possibilities. These things can happen. Just to ask, because we've done other episodes where you really want to vet the funeral home and things like that. Is there a universe where you can kind of pick a plot or have some sort of contract in place or something to say like, I want this loved one in a place where you're not going to ever have to move or shift, or, do funeral homes ever do that? And is that a possibility or not really?
It's really hard. It would be a cemetery that did it. And it's, you'd have to buy a lot of land, right? Because you'd have to basically be on an island in a place where they're lining up grave next to grave a couple of feet apart. Right. I mean, they're not even a couple of feet apart. They're a couple of inches apart. But I mean, it's, 4 feet or 3 feet and 3 feet and 3 feet. And in between them is inches. And so if they need to get into the middle somewhere, it's inevitable that they're going to have to move these headstones. And not all places move them well. But yeah, that's something we get a lot of calls about is just moving of headstones.
I imagine if you just invest in like a mausoleum, then that's the way you protect yourself, but still it's
right. That'll cost you a fortune. And even still, even if you buy land, there might be somebody that bought land 20 years ago and now they finally passed. Sure. So either way, they're going to have to come back in there. A second thing that we get calls about all the time, that isn't necessarily something went wrong, is grave sinking. Okay. So when somebody gets buried, they put soil on top of them, and that soil, with rain, with, weather, with the way that, the gaps in air around the casket or vault itself, that ground will sink. It's natural. The soil will compact. And so sometimes we've seen instances, a lot of traditions or a lot of religions, they tell you that you're not supposed to come back to the cemetery for X amount of time, right? But some traditions, they do the burial and they come right back, right?
Yeah.
And so we've seen it when people come back, whether it's a week later or a few weeks later, and the ground's completely sunken and they think that some other burial happened there or something else happened, but it's completely normal for the ground to sink in a grave shortly after it was buried. And it's actually usually in the cemetery's best practices that after a few weeks, they come back in and fill the soil and add soil to that, which is, by the way, another reason why those headstones might be out of place for a prolonged period of time.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. And let's say it's in a situation where down the road, it's you're noticing you come in 5 years, 10 years down and it's sunken. Is that something where you can ask the funeral home to fix it, or they don't have to? Is that an extra expense? Like, I imagine there's scenarios where it's, hey, this sank. make sure I'm using my grammar, sank, sunk, that sort you asked the funeral home, hey, can you prop this back? The cemetery, thank you, to prop this back up. They go, that's an added expense. Like, is that something that happens and then you have a conflict, or how?
Yeah, I mean, that might be a conflict. Usually that wouldn't be an issue. It's just putting a little bit of land on it, and they have plenty of land laying around. No, but we could talk about what is a red flag if it's sinking, right?
Yep.
So red flags is something that in this kind of context is if you see fresh dirt around your grave or on or in a grave that you own, right? And it's been a while. There's no reason to put additional soil on, and it's been flat ground, and all the grass is dead and now there's soil. Well, maybe they buried somebody there that they shouldn't have into one of your spaces. And that's one of the biggest things that we see that is an issue at the cemetery practice or in the cemetery kind of space is sometimes graves get double sold. And it's very unfortunate when it happens. It's usually because cemeteries aren't great at keeping records or great at keeping maps, or they don't update something that somebody sold and then somebody else resells it. So the thing that we see a lot is, somebody buys 2 spaces for mom and dad or grandpa and grandma, right? And then only one of them has passed at that time. So they bury grandma or grandpa, right? And then grandma is alive for another 20 years, right? And then somewhere in between the time where they bury grandfather and, the 20 years that grandma's still alive, somebody else is buried in that grave. And people come out to that gravesite and they're like, why is there fresh dirt right next to grandpa? I thought we owned this space. And so that is an absolute red flag that you definitely want to reach out to somebody about. And, the cemetery is supposed to correct that issue. Like, they have to reach out to that family who they buried in the wrong spot, explain to them that this person's been buried in the wrong spot. They need to be moved, or they're going to need to compensate pretty much everybody for it.
Wow. And I imagine you come in, you see there's is there a difference in terms of, I don't even know how to ask the question. Is there, like, when you see that, because I can imagine if I came up and I just saw fresh soil there, right? And there's a difference between some maybe excess soil from somebody that was buried nearby,
Right,
maybe
right.
versus what a fresh plot looks like, right? What is the process? If you go and accuse the cemetery of doing that, they're probably going to say, no, we didn't, right? Is going to be the first question. And how do you even go about proving it? And what are those next steps?
Document.
Okay.
Right? The same thing that we've said before.
So
take
photos,
a picture. Yeah, take a picture, maybe make a video. A lot of people, I say this is funny. I guess it's not funny because we're talking about the cemetery practice and it's a very, sad thing, heavy topic. But a lot of people will take this little picture that just focuses in right here. And then you can't tell what we're looking at. So take a couple of pictures, take a video. As you're taking the video, maybe explain what you're showing
and seeing,
and maybe point to it.
I would say, just bringing in my video background for a second to support that, is using the word context. So you need to see this in context, right? Which means a wide shot, I would take 10, 15 steps backwards, right? Maybe you even want to see some of the other gravestones in the foreground, your plot in the middle. And then, so now I can see in a wider picture as an attorney or as anybody.
What are we looking at?
What are we seeing, right? Because if I see just a close up of the soil, I don't know that looks any different than any of the other plots. But if I back up and you can see, a foot of tall grass in every plot except yours, now all of a sudden we have context.
Yep.
And I would say do both, right? So take that photo, take close-ups, take wide shots, and then do video. And this is going to be, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's going to help people that are watching this. I really love when people do video is this is a big recommendation I always make, is think like a photographer. So a lot of times what people will do is, where's my phone here? You grab your phone and you take a picture. I frame you, I take my photo, right? When a video camera, all of a sudden now I'm doing all this kind of stuff that makes it hard to watch, hard to see. Same thing with video. Stand back, hit record, let it unfold on screen, and then talk and stay still. think like a photographer, right? Shoot your video like a photographer. And I think you're going to get better content, which is going to make it easier to process your case. Thanks. That's my area of expertise. I love
dip
it in there, Anton.
I love it. And I will add one more thing that's specific to the cemetery industry.
Sure.
Cemeteries are huge open spaces. Okay. For you to say it's right next to the tree, or for you to say it's right next to the path, is not helpful. So you have to help triangulate, right? So potentially, Google Maps it, zoom in on where you're standing, whatever it may be, show this huge tree, or here's this mausoleum that's over here. And this is, because we get so many pictures, and look, not all cemeteries have a bunch of headstones in them.
Right.
A lot of cemeteries have a lot of unmarked graves, right? And so it's like, yeah, well, it's kind of in the middle over there. That doesn't really help.
That's not going to help.
And so if you're going to document and you're going to take pictures and videos, document in a way that you could explain to somebody that's never seen this before. You are living it. We know that you know where it is. You got to explain it to somebody else. And then the other thing that would help often is put in something for scale. I've seen somebody put in a pool noodle for scale to show, hey, we all know how big a pool noodle is. Look at how far this headstone is from where it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right? It's like 4 pool noodles away. Right? Or, obviously not everybody's got a ruler, but something for scale that would be helpful because, again, we don't know distances just by looking at a photograph.
That's a great point. Yeah.
The next thing that you want in the document era is walk into the actual office of the cemetery and ask them for the records that pertain to your graves. Ask them for a copy of the map. They have lot cards. Ask them for a lot card that pertains to this space, because, that will get them looking at the records that they're supposed to keep. And maybe they did make a mix up, and maybe they admit to you on the spot right then and there that they did make a mistake.
Right. Okay. I think those are great points. Is there, odd question, but in that environment, I imagine, like, if I'm going through the record right then and there, and they're showing it to me, is it, am I allowed to take a picture? Is it possible that they could say, well, no, this is private because there's other plots here? Is that a red flag? What do you think about that?
They are very protective about other people's private information, but anything that pertains to your graves, they should be willing to give you a copy of, or that you should be able to photograph. Ultimately what we wind up doing once you involve a lawyer is we wind up getting information about the surrounding graves. And more often than not, they're going to redact the names and the addresses, or just keep, first initial, last initial, just so you know who you're referencing.
So it might not be completely crazy for them to say, like, you can't take a photo of this, because I would say, especially if it's a contentious thing, I don't want them to.
But at least your records, give me a copy of my file.
Correct.
Right. And I think that's reasonable. Should we go into other things that aren't an issue? That
I think so, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Another thing we constantly get phone calls about is when some of your decorations have been moved, right? People put up fences around their graves. They plant trees. They plant bushes. They do all sorts of things to decorate their grave. Very reasonable. I think it's, admirable. I've done it to graves of my family too.
Sure.
But you should know that the rules and regulations for most cemeteries do say that they can remove all of those things. And so the one thing, before you get all worked up, before you go calling lawyers, and before you threaten to sue, is to ask for a copy of the rules and regulations. Generally that's a good practice to get that before you, agree to, or not even plant a tree, but before you even bury somebody there.
Sure.
Right. To ask if this is allowed or if that's allowed. But just know that most cemeteries' rules and regulations will say that, our landscaper, we're not responsible for what our landscapers do. Like, you can't put a fence around this. You can't put a fence around that.
Well, we also mentioned earlier that, if sometimes they need to get to a plot and they need to move gravestones, and you've planted a tree there or put a fence up around that space, like, that's going to have, they're probably going to have some flexibility to move those pieces, and they're not necessarily going to put them back the way that they found them. Right. So,
right.
Checking that in the rules.
Yeah. And so again, that's normal. I always tell people, look at what you're signing with these cemeteries. Look before you buy, right? Don't forget, you're their customer. You're spending thousands of dollars with them. And a lot of people just, they get shown pieces of paper and they just sign the dot, right? If you're going to go and buy 10 graves, 20 graves at a time, or 5 graves at a time, some families, certain cultures put big kind of monuments, and they buy multiple graves at a time. And, they're spending tens of thousands of dollars on graves. if you spend tens of thousands of dollars on graves, you could potentially dictate the rules of what you will sign and what you won't sign. So make sure you read it. Make sure you go through the rules and regulations and say, well, wait a second, we should agree right now that I'm going to put a big monument here and I will plant trees and you're not going to cut down my trees.
I love that as a thought because I think that a lot of people, for the most part, aren't necessarily planning that far out in the future. They're maybe not thinking through a lot of these things. Even if they are planning in the future, it's still an emotional decision. And we always talk about, look at the contracts, check the terms, vet your cemetery. But there's another part of it that you just described, which is, frankly, negotiation and leverage, which is something that you don't think about, which is, yeah, you can, if you're going to buy a huge plot, dictate some of the terms. And I think that's important for people to think about even as they have that mindset going into that situation, because I imagine that most people just go, I get what I get and I don't get upset. And,
right.
And there's some opportunities. And I imagine that's for everybody, right? If you are buying one site, one grave site or multiple, ask those questions because that might help you avoid issues in the future.
Yeah. And get those promises in writing because, there's so much turnover at some of these cemeteries that, person A promised you this last month and, 3 months later, person A is no longer there.
Yeah.
And so you want to get these things in writing. You want to make sure that you understand what you're signing. And this all started with the rules and regulations is know the rules and regulations of the cemetery at the moment when you sign this stuff. But we can go into, we said what's not a red flag, which is them moving kind of your
plot, your gravestone,
the trinkets you would have put there, or the gravestone, or the fences or plantings. Right. That's usually not a red flag. But what is a red flag is if, again, the soil on your loved one's grave was disturbed, right? So we talked about potentially the soil next to your grave being, an issue because they might have sold your grave, but potentially the soil on your grave being disturbed, right? There's usually no reason for that, but we've seen cases where they accidentally bury. So, I don't know if we've explained the difference between a double depth and a single depth grave.
I don't think so.
I know we have blogs about it. So there's this concept called a double depth graves, right? So most of us know, 6 feet under. 6 feet under, we all know that's where a grave should be. It should be 6 feet under the soil. It's actually not 6 feet under the soil. The bottom of the casket is at 6 feet. So technically the top of the casket's not 6 feet under, but that's
interesting.
Neither here nor there.
Know that. That's yeah.
So, but
that's good to know too, because if you're standing there going like, that doesn't look like 6 feet to me. It probably isn't.
Right. So a single depth grave is usually a grave that's at 6 feet and that's it. There's this concept called the double depth grave, and a lot of cemeteries are doing that now. It's usually to save costs, for them, it's to make more money. For the person buying the graves, it's to save costs. It's, you can buy one grave now and bury, grandma and grandpa on top of each other, or you could, buy 2 or 3 graves and bury 4 to 6 people in there. So what winds up happening is you have the first grave at 8 feet depth, and then you have a second grave at 6 feet depth, right? And so what we've also seen happen is, along with the line of, double selling graves, cemeteries also mess up into which grave they're burying someone. And so if grandma was buried at double depth at 8 feet, 20 years ago, and all of a sudden you see disturbed soil on top of her grave, there's a non-0% chance that somebody is buried on top of her that should not be.
Right.
And so, that is a red flag. So if they move some of your trinkets, move your headstone, generally that's within the rules and regulations. But if they disturbed a grave that's been there for, several years undisturbed, that could be a problem.
Fascinating. And so again, that comes down to seeing the soil. Is there any specific, and maybe we can put up, I don't know if there's photos that you have that could be shared or something that just like kind of helps people understand what to look for, because I don't know. I think this makes sense to me, but I imagine somebody who's never seen anything like this, and you're not in landscaping and you're not in this space, you could make a mistake and pick the wrong thing, or you could also ignore something that's an actual red flag.
Yeah. So we have, check out the Kaminsky Law website. We have a bunch of blogs about the cemetery thing. Unfortunately, we do it a lot. I was just talking to a lawyer on the other side of it, and he's like, you keep suing me. I'm like, you guys keep screwing up. You know what I mean? It's unfortunate. It stops screwing up, we'll stop suing you.
Right. No, it makes total sense. And I love that aggressive approach on behalf of your clients, that you're protecting their interests. Are there any other Are there any other things that we should share that are potential red flags or probably something that's not a red flag?
I think we've covered them. If we think of anything, we'll make another video.
Yep, I love it. Well, again, just to summarize, these are great, rewatch this video. If you're visiting a loved one, if you regularly go to the cemetery to do that, and you see some of these things, some of the things are going to be in that category of this is normal, and some of them are definitely going to be red flags, and make sure to look out for them. Thanks, Anton.
Absolutely. Have a good one.